Well, welcome to the Mind of Christ study. This is section 49 in A.T. Robertson's list of sections in the chronology of the life of Christ, the harmony of the Gospels. This is a very, very long section. It's going to cover the entire chapter of John chapter 5. The occasion is the healing of a man who was paralyzed, but it opens the door for quite a bit of teaching that Jesus is going to do. So this is one of those sections that is long and has some very difficult parts to it. And so we're only going to take this in some small bites so that we can do justice to the text. I think we'll get through quite a bit today, but again, it may take 3 weeks, maybe 4, to cover it adequately. I want to remind you that as we go through the Mind of Christ, our intention and our purpose is to make sure that we are acquiring the mind of Christ for the purpose of becoming like Him. It's part of the discipling process that if we're going to understand who Jesus is and follow Him, then we're going to have to know Him. And that means just knowing more than just simply quoting what He said or being able to retell the story. If it's going to become an integral part of our own lives, where we make it a part of our daily practice, then we have to learn how to think like Him. So this is some in-depth stuff. This is more meat than it is milk. And therefore, I would encourage you to have your Bible ready and maybe even take some notes and do some other things that will help you understand what we're doing here. So, as usual, I want to start with reading the text. I'm not going to read the entire chapter this time because it's very long, and we're not going to be able to cover it all anyway today. So I'm going to read the first 17 verses because I think that will give us a good flavor for the story part, and even if we don't cover every bit of the first 17 verses today. So, John chapter 5, beginning in verse 1. After these things, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porticos. In these lay a multitude of those who were sick, blind, lame, and withered, waiting for the moving of the waters. Now I want you to note here, in many Bibles you will see brackets or you'll see an italics or you'll see something indicating that what I'm reading now was not in some of the better text of the Bible. We'll come back to that. But it says there, waiting for the moving of the waters, for an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred up the water, and whoever then first, after the stirring of the water, stepped in was made well from whatever disease with which he was afflicted. Now we come back to the more reasonable text here. And a certain man was there who had been 38 years in his sickness. When Jesus saw him lying there, he knew that he had already been a long time in that condition, and he said to him, "Do you wish to get well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, but while I am coming, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Arise, take up your pallet, and walk." And immediately the man became well, and he took up his pallet, and he began to walk. Now it was the Sabbath on that day, and therefore the Jews were saying to him who was cured, "It is the Sabbath, and it's not permissible for you to carry your pallet." But he answered them, "He who made me well was the one who said to me, 'Take up your pallet and walk.'" And they asked him, "Well, who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your pallet and walk'?" But he who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had slipped away while there was a crowd in that place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "Behold, you have become well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse may befall you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. And for this reason, the Jews were persecuting Jesus because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But he answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I myself am working." Okay. Again, there's a lot of details to unpack here, and we'll dive into this. So he mentions here that the occasion is a feast of the Jews, and that Jesus is coming it says he's coming into Jerusalem, obviously, to celebrate this feast. And Robertson, in his chronology, sees this as Jesus coming from Galilee after he had called Matthew and after he had talked about fasting. Those were the things we covered most recently. And now he's coming down into Jerusalem for this feast of the Jews. The feast in itself is not named in the text, but Robertson suggests, and it is reasonable, that it is a Passover feast. And if it is the Passover, it is the second Passover that Jesus has celebrated since his public ministry has started. The word feast here, it just simply means a solemn feast or a public festival. It's especially used, though, in relationship to the Passover. Reading his life, it seems that Jesus attended all the required feasts. In other words, those required by Moses and the law. It is interesting to me that his disciples are not mentioned as being with him, nor his family mentioned. We should not assume, I guess, anything by this, but they're not mentioned in this story. When Jesus says, or when John says, after these things, he's not specific. In his context, he has just referred to the ministry in Galilee. So it is logical to say that after his ministry work in Galilee, he came to Jerusalem for this feast. And when it says coming up is to Jerusalem, it's all about the terrain, since Jerusalem is on a hill. So almost anyone who comes to Jerusalem is going to come up to Jerusalem. It mentions the sheep gate. This is an internal gate to the temple area. It's not a gate of the city or the outer wall. It suggests that this is a gate through which sacrifice animals are brought. John describes the pool near this gate as Bethesda. And you may recognize that we often name hospitals Bethesda. And of course, there's cities, sometimes Bethesda. So this pool was discovered in the 19th century. The name means house of mercy or grace. It's interesting that the word for mercy here is Hesda, in light of the discussion that we had in Hosea 6:6 in the call of Matthew story, where we talked about Hesed. It's the same root word as Hesed. The Hebrew was likely more Aramaic, the common language of the Jews at the time. The 5 porticos it mentions there, or porches that surround this pool. The word for pool means to swim or to dive. It's a place where anyone may swim, a pond or a pool. So not exactly sure what the function of this pool was. It could be a public bath. It could be a swimming pool. Those who congregated there are described as the sick, the blind, the lame, and the withered. Of course, the sick are those who are powerless. They're infirmed. Metaphorically, could mean those who are in doubt or have some kind of hesitation. It's the same word is used in Romans 15 and verse 1 to describe someone who has a dispute or is weak in some kind of way. The idea of the withered in this text is the so-called withered, or the dry land. It's used in Matthew 12 and verse 10. Also, the man with a withered hand It's used in Mark 9:18, and the New American Standard Bible uses the phrase stiffen out. So to make one stiff or withered. The King James says, he pineth away. There is a loss of life or elasticity, a kind of like an old wineskin or an old cloth he mentions in the last story. So people who have lost some elasticity in their muscles or whatever. The Nestle's text omits 3b through 4, verse 4. The New American Standard Bible sets this apart in brackets. And remember, I mentioned to you there is a section there that is not considered to be a part of the best manuscripts. And so that's why you will find them in brackets, or in some Bibles you may find them down at the bottom of the page and left out completely. However, the sentiment of what is inserted there is found in verse 7 in a uncorrupted text. Verse 7 suggests that there is some activity concerning the water that led them to believe in its healing properties. When the water, it says, was troubled, or when it was stirred up. This means agitated or troubled. To give other examples of where this word is used is Matthew chapter 2 and verse 3. When Herod heard of Jesus' birth, he was troubled, he was stirred up. When the disciples saw Jesus walking on the sea, they were frightened, or they were stirred up, or they were disturbed. John chapter 12 verse 27, Jesus' soul became troubled in view of the hour being at hand. John 13 verse 21, Jesus became troubled in his spirit in thinking of the one who would betray him. In Acts 15 verse 24, in the letter sent from Jerusalem to Antioch, it acknowledges that some of those from Jerusalem sent without authority disturbed you with their words, unsettling your soul. And so we can stir people up either in good ways or in bad ways by what we say. In Galatians 1 and verse 7, some who distort the gospel are disturbing you. So again, the waters are disturbed, they're stirred up, they're unsettled. So what is this troubling of the water? Someone thought they should explain it by adding to the text. And their explanation was that an angel of the Lord was doing it, providing healing for whoever got in first. Of course, this supernatural explanation sounds plausible and would explain why this man and others were there. But is it true or merely conjecture based on the word in verse 7, the word stirred there? So if not what stirred the waters? How were the waters stirred? If it was an angel, how did they become stirred? I could think of many natural means by which it might, example like the release of air in pockets beneath the ground. But this would not explain why so many gathered there, except for maybe some superstition that they may have had. This occurs in places all over the world and is attached to many different religions. I guess there's no way to really know for sure what was going on at Bethesda on that occasion. The fact is that the man was there and he had been sick for 38 years. That's a very long time. And Jesus is the one who sought him out for healing. And why him? Why did Jesus look for this particular man? Others were there. Nothing is said about their being healed. It was, though, the Sabbath. The Jews were watching. Jesus tells him to take up his pallet and walk. And this broke the rules. Jesus slips away, and then leaving the man to fend for himself with the Jewish leaders. Later, we're going to find that Jesus is going to return, and he engages the man, and he engages with the Jews on that occasion. So let's talk about all of these. 38 years is a long time, 1 year longer than when I wrote this back in 2011, that I had currently been married. Perhaps he was born this way, we don't know, or he contracted a disease in infancy. He was sick long enough to confirm that he was actually sick. Did Jesus go specifically to him knowing that this was the one who would receive healing that day? And did he merely happen upon him? We don't know exactly why Jesus picked this particular man out. So Jesus asked him the key question, do you wish to get well? Now, the word well here means sound or healthy, of good health of the body, or it can even be sound teaching or well teaching, sound doctrine. Again, I must ask what I cannot totally know. Was Jesus feeling sorry for one afflicted and depending on a superstition to heal him? If so, why didn't Jesus attack the superstition and tell all those sitting around the pool to go home? Often I'm amazed at what Jesus does not do as much as what he does do. The focus comes to be on that fact that this was the Sabbath day. That becomes the whole focus of this story. And surely the man wants to get well, or why else did he come there daily to the pool? Just thought of this, but I wonder, how did he get there on the Sabbath day? Who carried him there? Or did he stay overnight, never went home on Friday night, just stayed over until the Sabbath day because no one could carry him home? I don't know. Was it the fellowship of the miserable? This is where all the miserable people came to just hang out every day. Did the ailing sit around and talk about how bad they were or where they hurt? Or was this kind of like a nursing home? And was the man simply dropped off each day? Did he have food and water? And how did he go to the bathroom? Who was his friend or family members who brought him there each day? Can you imagine how much better their life was not to have this daily task? Whose prayer did Jesus really answer in healing this man? And did I'm sorry, I'm having trouble reading my notes here. And had this man been in a situation where he had seen people over and over again get into the water first and be healed, and maybe there were others who were in line next and Jesus passed over them. Jesus, he's offering a freedom from the only life this man has known for 38 years. The man's answer shows how his dependence on others. He says to him, he doesn't say, I want to get well. He says, I have no man to put me in. Certainly there are those who have no choice but to depend on those who can help put them in, quote unquote. But others come to expect others to do it for them. I'm not saying that's the case of this man, but it just brings up this idea. This dependence creates a social mess that cripples the society that it leans on for help. Perhaps Jesus' question was a reality check. Do you really want to get well? If so, why do you keep doing day in and day out the same thing, expecting different results? In other words, why do you keep coming here? If you really want to get well, why do you keep doing this? Because you've been doing it for a very long time and nothing new has happened. This is insanity. Jesus was his alternative, and this was his new day. I would add that Jesus is our alternative to insanity. According to the text, the man never really answered Jesus' question. Instead, he gave his reason, his excuse for being in this condition after such a long time. But he didn't say he wanted to be well. Nothing was said of his willingness, his faith. He didn't even know who Jesus was. This appears to be merely a sovereign act of God without obvious conditions, like choosing Jacob, for instance, over Esau in Romans chapter 9. That it just was a sovereign choice. Did Jesus deliberately look for someone to heal on the Sabbath just to cause a ruckus? Was this man healing a prop in a larger discussion? This brings up perspective. To the man, this was all about his being made well. He was the center of attention. The important thing about that day to him was that his life was totally changed. It was a new beginning. But from Jesus' perspective, what was more important was it was the opportunity for the teaching that followed. The healing was a means to a greater end. It was an attention getter, and it led to a much bigger discussion than just simply healing someone. The discussion that followed would benefit millions, while one man's healing, no matter how dramatic, would only benefit a few. Jesus told the man to do three things. He told him to arise, and number two, to take up your pallet, and number three, walk. This simple, everyday task. But what seemed simple turned into very complicated very quickly. The Jews had rules. Of course, the backdrop for all the rules is God's statement to keep the Sabbath holy. God was the one who said to keep the Sabbath holy. The Sabbath is sunrise, a few minutes before the sunset, to sunset, till you can see three stars in the sky. All of this is modern day. Festive meals are eaten on Friday night, Saturday morning, and Saturday afternoon. Shabbat means resting or ceasing from labor. References to it in the Old Testament: Genesis 2, 1 through 3, Exodus 16, 26, and Exodus 28 through 11. In modern Judaism, the Sabbath commemorates these three things in modern Judaism: redemption from slavery, the creation of the universe, and a taste of the Messianic age. Generally, the Sabbath was to be a time of celebration and refraining from even talk about work. It is thought that the work from which man rests is creative work or any changes made to the environment. Jeremiah 17 and verse 21 is important here. The prohibition is not to carry a load on the Sabbath or do any work. If you read the text of Jeremiah 17, it's easy to see why the Jews were concerned about this man carrying his mat on the Sabbath. Jeremiah is very plain that the simple act of carrying a load on the Sabbath has dire consequences. In the narrative that is talked about, that talks about Sabbath keeping, a couple of themes stand out. Number one, the authority that Jesus has over the Sabbath. So that's one of the themes that stand out here. He is the Lord of the Sabbath. And the hypocrisy of the Jews in condemning their fellow Jews while doing similar things that benefit themselves. Removing an animal from a ditch, for instance. And so we have two themes that stand out. One is the authority of Jesus as being Lord of the Sabbath. The other is the hypocrisy of the Jews in doing things on the Sabbath that they condemn in others. And then a third, and that is the purpose of the Sabbath, which was for man's benefit and not to be used as a hammer to beat them. But with all this said, the challenge to understand how God wants us to handle a command like Sabbath keeping and to be able to see it like Jesus does is admittedly very hard to do. And since Jesus is God and has the authority to do whatever he pleases with the Sabbath laws, does not mean that we can do the same thing at will. The lame man was right to take up his mat and walk on the Sabbath, regardless of any of the laws that might have pertained to this situation, simply because Jesus had the authority to tell him what to do. Jesus has demonstrated now, even though at the time the man didn't even know who was talking to him, but I guess he figured, if he could heal him, he had authority to tell him to take up his mat. Jesus has demonstrated this authority by forgiving sins on earth and by healing, a suspension of natural law for the good of man. But what are we to do? Does Jesus's practice give us permission or authority to do the same thing? He suspended the laws at times, but not at all times. He was selective. Should we assume we can be selective? What complicates the matter for me is that Sabbath keeping is not just a Mosaic law, but precedes all laws. It is rooted in creation. But since it was incorporated into Mosaic law, does the canceling of this law also cancel the obligation for Sabbath keeping? What is Jesus' real mind on this subject? Another complication for me is that Jesus seems to roll the idea of God and Jesus still working into the narrative. In other words, in that verse 17 of the text, he talks about both himself and God working, and he rolls that into the discussion now. For the man healed, it was simple, just as it was in John chapter 9. The man who healed me told me to carry my mat. Case closed. Anyone who can heal has authority to command. Was he afraid Jesus could take the healing away if he did not obey him? Well, the Jews focused on the question of who. And this was the right question. They put some energy or work into the investigation. As long as they did not pick up something, they were okay, I guess. Could Jesus be looking at the spirit of the law instead of the specific violation? Could the folks in Jeremiah's day be so greedy, except in many other things, to give any consideration to God, his will, and his day? The paralytic did not know who healed him. John says that Jesus slipped away. He withdrew. Literally, the word means to swim. He swam out. He escaped by swimming, generally to escape. I don't guess he swam across the pool of Bethesda, but he got clear of the place. He went somewhere else. But later, Jesus found the man in the temple. What was he doing there? Could it be that for 38 years he was not allowed in because of his defect? Perhaps he dreamed of going to the temple for the last 38 years. In some personal sin, if some personal sin was the reason for his paralysis, he had 38 years to think about his sin and its consequences. We don't know how old this man was. Let's say he was 58. At age 20, let's say he did something very, very stupid, very wrong. Perhaps he was with another man's wife who came home early and he was beaten by the man, and a vertebrae was ruptured and damaged his spinal cord, making it impossible for him to walk. Well, I guess it could have happened. But Jesus does connect the man's paralysis to sin. He says, "Behold, you have become well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse may befall you." Remember, in John, in John 9, remember in John 9 that the disciples tried to connect the man's blindness to his parents' sin or to his sin, and Jesus said that sin was not the reason for the man's blindness. Well, the word well here is the same as in verse 6. Do you want to get well? And now he says, you have become well. Well, this is the journey that we all have to take. When Jesus is in it, we can move from one to the other. In other words, Jesus can come to us in our sin and in our sickness, and he can say, do you want to get well? And we can move to the place of him saying, you are well. But I wonder if well has sunk in at this point to the man. Some do not do well. Many know how to do sick so well that they don't know how to do well when they are. I hope you followed all of that. Or could the sin Jesus is referring to not be the cause of the man's condition, but the attitude perhaps that he developed because of the condition? Perhaps he had become negative, critical, resentful, bitter, angry. Maybe he was crippled because of child abuse, and he has stewed on that for 38 years and was emotionally crippled by it. Well, let's rethink the sin connection. Does Jesus actually say that there is some specific sin that caused this man's condition? Not necessarily. Jesus could be saying, in addition to this man's physical problem, he has a more serious problem that can cause much greater consequences. Whoever or whatever caused his paralysis is nothing compared to the sin that he has and its effects. Later, Jesus will tell the woman caught in adultery to go and sin no more. This is a repentance message. Sin no longer. Just as he was done with sickness because of the one healing Jesus provided, so now he can be done with sin by the power and the forgiveness that Jesus provides. So what could be worse than being paralyzed for 38 years, trapped in a body that does not work, cannot enjoy life as God intended, cannot serve to be productive? Hell is worse, but shy of that, could the consequences of sin that come as a result of his new ability. You see, a paralyzed person is not immune from sin, even if it is the sin of the heart. Attitudes, words, sinful thoughts, manipulation, etc. may be very real and prevalent in his life, but mobility, now that he is well and he can walk and he can move around, provides him with an opportunity to do wrong. Perhaps he was resentful of someone who did not take care of him, or a wife that left him because of his sickness, etc. He could now confront the hurtful ones and do what might land him in jail, or worse. Better it's better to point to the fact that sin can cause worse things to happen. There's a definitive and definite consequence to sin. There's things that can, he says in the text, can befall you or happen to you, to come into existence, into your life, is what he's saying, to be created, to take place, to come to pass. Often today we hear phrases like, it happens. To Jesus, what happens is a consequence of something else. And the something else often is rooted in the will or the person to whom it happens, and the will of another who affects the happening of another. In either way, the happening is someone's responsibility. But we say it has the consequence. But when we say it sometimes, it happens, we sometimes mean that it's not a consequence. It's nobody's fault. It merely happens. You know, I don't really like this phrase, it happens. It's a cultural cue of our time. It speaks to anti-responsibility. So how might I respond if Jesus said directly to me, with my specific sin set, do not sin anymore? What if he said to me, don't sin anymore? Like in John 8, verse 11, to the adulterous woman, go and sin no more. Now, she had specifics in in mind. Was she the other woman or the spurned woman? Does it matter? It doesn't matter why she was in bed with someone who was not her husband. So when Jesus looks someone straight in the eye and says, "Stop sinning," what does he mean by it? And is his expectation that the person can stop sinning? Is it reasonable? Does Jesus underestimate the struggle of a person who may have especially a sin addiction? If a person says later or someday, in other words, well, I'll stop later or someday, what do they think will change that will make it doable then as opposed to now? If the sin is stress-induced as a coping mechanism, yet the sin itself carries its own stress because we realize we are being disobedient, then there is never a better time than now to break the cycle. And certainly when Jesus says there is a worse circumstance coming, if it is not dealt with now, then this worse circumstance will surely produce more stress. So it is less stressful to stop sinning now and to replace it with a healthy way of coping with the stress. But all of this is reasonable, but sin responses are never reasonable, regardless of all the mental justifications that we pull up on our screens to make it all right. And now, in this man's life, he had the constant stressor of being chronically ill. Jesus removed it immediately and replaced it with the stressor of responsibility. Because, again, it was stressful to be sick for 38 years, but it's also going to be stressful to be healed and to have many more opportunities to do good or to do evil. Now, the man had choices he did not previously have. Choices bring stress, but choice also relieves stress because we have actions that we can take. Decision often eliminates stress. Now, if all of this is true, and if Jesus knew this and more, then reducing his instructions to a simple command was like giving a person a medication, not bothering to tell them how it works. It is an act of trust that if I take the med, I will be better. So is the words, "Stop sinning," like a med that will make me better for all the reasons and that I mentioned and more. Now, but all I need to do is to swallow it, because it becomes now something, can I do this or not? So once the man knew it was Jesus who made him well, he went and he told the Jews, no motive is assigned to the man. In verse 11, they had asked him and he didn't know. The blind man healed in John chapter 9 had more of a dialogue with the Jewish leaders, but this man was also clear that it was the Jesus who made him well. That told him to take up his mat and walk. And from the looks of things, everyone who was all in the same location at this point. So in verse 16 says, the reason the Jews persecuted Jesus was because he did the healing on the Sabbath. The focus was not only the healing, but the day of the healing. To put it in rapid, to persecute somebody is to put something in rapid motion, to pursue, to follow, to pursue in a particular direction, to follow eagerly, to endeavor earnestly to acquire someone, to pursue with malignity, or to persecute. So when someone is persecuted, they're being followed, they're being pursued, they're being chased. Matthew 5, verses 10 and 12, Jesus teaches, blessed are those persecuted for righteousness' sake. Blessed are the persecuted for Jesus' sake. Promise of reward, because the prophets were also persecuted. Matthew 5:44, Jesus tells us to pray for those who persecute us. In other places, he warns his disciples that this will happen to them. It seems that those who follow Jesus will be followed or pursued malignantly. It is interesting, the response to the healing on the Sabbath was the interpretation as a violation, clearly implying that Jesus did in fact heal the man, was worthy of persecution, not some other sanction. Rebuke, correction, teaching, but why persecution? They could have rebuked him, they could have corrected him, they could have taught him better, or why did they persecute him? Were the Jewish leaders that threatened by what he did? Was it because Jesus might lead others astray, like the paralytic? Jesus is the persecuted God. It takes a lot of nerve to persecute God, don't you think? And how do you do that? How could you possibly think there will not be some problems with this? But they weren't thinking. Tradition and legalism reacts. A thought gets stuck in one's head, and once fixed becomes complete justification for a reaction. Jesus is doing good for a man trapped in his own body for 38 years. All they can see is it's the Sabbath day. On the Sabbath gets replaced with, in the worship sometimes, when we begin to talk about things or some other prohibited circumstance. Jesus came to teach us it is always the right time to do good. Now we're going to take a break there. We're going to stop there. There's so much more to go, and I didn't have a really great place to lop this off. Where we'll pick up again next week will be in verse 17, and we'll flesh this out some more about the Sabbath day. But we got enough here to give us a good start on understanding how all of this works. So just remember, in closing, that this is all about trying to attain the mind of Christ. This is a very difficult subject here. It is hard and difficult for us to understand how Jesus looked at this occasion, looked at this day, looked at what he did, but yet it challenges us, it stretches us in order to try to understand how Jesus thinks. And it's in those times that we are also stretched to become more like him. And so thank you for joining us. I hope you will join us hopefully live if you can come back. We had, I think, 25 in our service on Sunday. And if you can come back, we would love to see you in person. We're distancing and we're masking and we're doing a number of things here. But I just pray that you can be with us again soon as possible. God bless. Take care.